So our next speaker is the author of a blog called Camels With Hammers. He has a PhD in philosophy and spent 11 years teaching in college classrooms. Please welcome Dan Fincke.
I'm also a demon, sorry about that. Okay, so I am going to talk about where we left off with the last question for Jerry Coyne, which was ethics. And so I'm a moral philosopher, and my route to moral philosophy came through my deconversion. I deconverted while attending Grove City College, an hour north of here. Thank you, this is the only crowd that works on. Like, whoa! So it takes a Pittsburgh crowd to understand exactly what that means, right? So it is one of the most notorious evangelical colleges in the country. They went to the Supreme Court to fight for their right to not have Title IX enforced on them because they didn't want to be forced into equality by the oppressive evil government. And so, you know, so like everyone knew our one black student. And we were voted top 10 most nostalgic for Reagan, top 10 alternative lifestyles, non-alternative, top 10 for every kind of terrible category, like whitest, most homogeneous school. So I went there because there was a devout evangelical Christian, and I wound up deconverting by reading Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche is famously or infamously a very, very harsh critic of morality. Very, very skeptical of the legitimacy of morality as a, you know, something we can have objectivity about. And some even interpret him as having Leibniz rights for philosophy. Now, I became an objective moral realist while studying Nietzsche. So I come at this from a very skeptical standpoint, and I understand that in an adequately science-oriented skeptical community, objective morality is something that there's a lot of skepticism about. And so I'm going to try and explain the sorts of reasoning processes that made me convinced we need to talk about morality as an objective issue and not a matter of subjective preferences. For the sake of rationality, for the most rational account of things. And so that's what I'm going to try and argue for. And because I could give you, I'm going to give you my account of how we should approach ethics. But I also want to kind of do this work of dealing with some of these skeptical objections. And so where I want to focus here at first is that when we're talking about objectivity or subjectivity and morality, this is a very false, simplistic dichotomy, okay? Because what this assumes is that it's either up or down, yes or no, total objectivity, total subjectivity. 1 ounce of relativity makes for relativism. 1 ounce of subjective elements makes for subjectivism. And what I want to point out, and one of the things Nietzsche got me to see, ironically, is that mindset assumes a certain standard and a definition of morality that comes from an absolutist conception of morality. The absolutists of a religious stripe that we're kind of arguing against, they're the ones who say that unless morality is this thing which is unchanging across time, it can't be valid. Unless morality is this thing which takes no account of circumstances, it can't be valid. Right? What they do is they set up this either or, where if you have any empiricism, if you have any change, any circumstantial responsiveness, you're a relativist. And when we acknowledge that, right, when we make those arguments, we accept a bogus and illegitimate standard of reasoning. Because we don't use that reasoning in science. We don't say that, like, so for example, a very simple case of this is climate science, right? And they say, it snowed, therefore, global warming is a myth, right? And Stephen Colbert did a wonderful bit where he said, oh no, it's dark out, the sun's gone. You know, like, oh no, right? And that's the response people have when they say, oh, morality is all subjective. Why? Well, because there's this exception case. If we were on a desert island, then you would have to eat me, right? Yeah, but we're not on a desert island. And so that doesn't mean that the judgment it's wrong to eat you is invalid, right? And what I want to point out is this, is that this idea that morality to be objective, one of the ways that that's conceived is to say that it must be an object in the world. that it must be the kind of thing that you would discover with particle physics, right? So Terry Pratchett has a very famous quote where he says, you know, you could grind down the world to the finest powder, but in the atoms you won't find an atom of morality. Gotcha, morality. Okay, where's the atom of evolution? Right? Where's the atom of the number 2? Not everything that is real is an atom. And that sort of approach is myopic. Okay, biology, evolution's a real thing because formal categories about the nature of morphology, about function, about relative generations, ancestors to descendants, looking at the different morphologies, looking at how these things change, looking at how functions change. Those sorts of differences make it so that the most coherent and rational account of things is evolution. That's not because we have a microscope that found evolution, right? We find it by giving the most coherent and rationally consistent normative account of reality. And we say that the most normative way to look at this evidence, the most rational way, the most consistent way, and make sense of all the experience, is to say evolution is real. Well, so what I want to argue is that the same sorts of standards, coherency, internal consistency, looking at things and how they function, can be an objective guide to figuring out what is moral. But in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to define what kind of a question is morality objective? And this is where I think the serious issue comes in. The question of how can you have objective morality is a practical question. It is not a question that says, what is the one object I can point to and say, this is morality, it's this thing right here. I don't even know what this is, maybe that is it. It's not that kind of a question. The kind of question people are asking when they ask, where's objective morality? What they're asking is this: is there any such thing as a reason to do what I don't want to do? Ever. That's the question. It really boils down to that question. Is there a reason for me to do what I don't want to do? You tell me not to kill the puppy. I want to kill the puppy. Is there any good reason for you not to do that? Right? That's the idea. Right? I want to do this. Is there a good reason not to? And my point is this. That's what people are really asking about. They're not asking if goodness is an objective property. That is an abstract philosophical question that most of science won't do well on, most of math won't do well on. Like, so for example, the number 5. Is that a real thing? There are 5s of things, but can you point to 5? If Ken Ham comes in and says, I don't believe in the number 5 unless I see one, what are you going to say to Ken Ham? You don't understand what the number 5 is, right? And the abstract question of whether or not there is an abstract object, number 5, floating in the atmosphere, like beyond reality, that's a mathematician's question. That's not what morality, and so the question is the same thing with goodness. If Ken Ham comes in and says, the laws of nature, we weren't there 4,000 years ago, or 8,000 years ago, so we don't know there was a universe back then. Because it's not science, because you can't see in a laboratory. Ken Ham is abusing the rhetoric that science is about empirical things, right? And he's trying to say it could be that the laws of nature only started acting regularly in the last 6,000 years. Before that, they didn't. Right? That, it could be that way. When Ken Ham says that, we say no. Not because we can go to a laboratory and that shows. What we can do is look at the empirical information we have and make a rational, consistent, coherent account and say that the consistency, the internal strength of the argument is more rational. And that's why all the evidence points this way on every rational metric we have for measuring ages. The radiocarbon dating does it, looking at the lengths of the stars, the distance that they are away. All of this tells us the age of the universe, even if we can't see it. The thing that says the universe is 1 million years old. It's about taking the evidence and combining it in a rational way. And so scientists don't give an account of things that has no elements of coherency, consistency, value preferences. It's a simpler answer to say that the universe is 6,000 years old and that the laws of the universe didn't change 6,000 years ago. Why is that a simpler answer? Because it doesn't have this arbitrary, no good reason for it, right? It makes more sense of the evidence. And so because of that, we have a value that we will call true, that which makes more sense of the evidence. So the question then is this: with the word goodness, can we just be willy-nilly? The word true, we say, has to measure standards of consistency, has to measure standards of coherence, has to measure standards of what we see. Well, why would it be any different with the word good? So if someone were to say to you, I think this is a great bridge, and you just say, yeah, but it only goes halfway across. And they say, no. To me, the only true bridge is one which leaves room to jump. That's good to me, man. Right? Like, if they're saying that, they're not like, that's not just their preference. They prefer bridges that don't go the whole way. The point is, bridge has a meaning. A bridge has a function, has a purpose, a goal. And that is to get across to the other side. You have an objective standard. Is that a good bridge or not? Or a doctor. And you say, this is a man, I love this doctor. You say, why? He says, all his patients die. You're like, is he Kevorkian? No, he's a pediatrician. All the kids come and they leave dead. And you say, well, is that a good doctor? By the definition of a doctor, it's not. Right? Like by the definition of a doctor, there's a function that you can judge it by. Can it get better? Can they make people better? Etc. But then you say, but nature doesn't have functions. Really? 5 minutes left? Okay, I'll try. So if you say nature can't have, including with the extra from the break? Oh, all right. My point is this. When you have this sort of functionalism, they say, well, humans don't have any functions, right? But that's like saying that we have no idea what the heart does, right? Maybe it's there ornamentally, right? Maybe, but that's not how we reason. We don't reason that way in science. In science, every time we find an organ we don't understand, what do we try and do? What sort of circumstances made this thing evolve, right? We don't just assume that there's no validity whatsoever to a functional explanation. But you might say, yes, but it just happens to function that way. It doesn't have to. But what I'm saying is this. When a biologist just designates this is a heart, that's a hand, what they're doing is they're recognizing a functional pattern. In other words, hands across species don't have the same exact empirical properties, but what we wind up doing is saying the function of gripping is real enough that it's a biological category to call it a hand across various species. My point is we use this kind of language because we understand that certain things do tend towards certain functionalities. So if you were to say the best mathematician is one who doesn't know how to divide, that's a bad definition of a mathematician. If you were to say the best doctor is one who doesn't know how to heal, the best city planner is the one where the city collapses. You know, the best artist is the one who doesn't evoke any emotions or say anything true or, you know, or cause feelings of delight. If you were to say those things, it would be irrational. And the thing is, morality is no different than that, because morality is a matter of certain standards of consistency. If someone says, we have the best baseball team, and you say, did you win the most games? They say, no, we're just redheaded. Redheads are the best baseball players. Like, you know that's a wrong definition for assessing a good baseball player. And so what I'm saying is, what is a good human being? Well, look at what we are. We're naturalists. We should be able to look at what we are and say, is this an excellently functioning human being? And what we can say is for any given human, are they maximizing these various abilities and their potentials? And that's an objective question. How strong are they in reasoning? How strong are they in their emotional lives? How strong are they in their aesthetics? Now, of course, we don't want to get into the eugenic route, right? Of then saying, well, if someone can't do those things, they're not worth anything as a human. But my point is this, is we have ways of assessing for any given human. Are they functioning according to their characteristic properties that make them the kind of being that they are? So any particular being within their abilities, are they maximizing that potential? And what, more importantly, the moral question comes in when we say, what sorts of codes make that happen? What sorts of codes are internally consistent? What sorts of codes lead to the maximum flourishing? Not just preferences about flourishing, but our objective flourishing. We have abilities. And if someone decides that they just want to believe that Allah says we can destroy a fundamental part of someone's powers, their sexuality, that's not like an indifferent thing. That's a fundamental power constitutive of their very being. We are our powers. We are our reason. We are our emotions. We are our sexuality. We are our athleticism. We are these powers. If you destroy them, you destroy us. The idea that we have that's a preference whether or not that's good or bad for us. It's not just a preference whether it's good or bad for us. On our own powers, on our own nature, there's certain things are bad for us. If you destroy an excellent capacity, an ability to function well, you're destroying something that constitutes someone's very being. And so if you destroy their sexuality, you're going after the core of their very being. Now, if you want to say that the other person says, that's okay, oh, really? So it's a good principle, let's apply that consistently. Let's destroy one of your fundamental constituents of being. And if they don't do that, that's inconsistency. And what do we call inconsistency in thinking? Irrational. Why is it not inconsistency irrational when it's an inconsistency in practice? When you treat like cases differently, that's irrational. It's illogical. You're saying this is the category, and we have this kind of belief related to this sort of experience. But then this other experience is exactly the same, and you don't make the same a standard. That's irrationality in reasoning. Well, if you look at two circumstances, and you say, in this circumstance, I treat people this way, but because of the difference in their hair color, I treat them differently in this other case, you're being formally inconsistent and irrational, and you can't square it. When you ask bigots for justifications for their beliefs, they have to lie. They have to make up arguments that they think will work, but they're clearly failing. So I know I'm out of time. Could you have questions?
Yeah, you can go.
Yeah. So I just want to say this. If you talk to a bigot, the bigot will have to make arguments. They don't just get to say, I just hate gays. They're not allowed to say that. They have to make up arguments because they know the rules of reasoning. Okay? So why should we say, oh, our support of gays or our support of humans, our humanism, as opposed to your faith-based ethics, that's just our preferences. We just happen to like gays. When in reality, no, we actually are looking at the evidence here. When morality is a functional thing, it's a functional thing that serves why we should do what we in the short term don't want to do, when we, for selfish reasons, don't want to do. There are reasons that override our selfish preferences. One of them is rational consistency and a formal, practical consistency in their action. When someone is acting inconsistently towards gays, when they're taking their sex organs and saying, you shall live governed by the nature of your sex organs. Your sex organs should fulfill their full potential at the expense of you fulfilling your emotional potential, your love potential, your social potential. All these positive functionings of your inherent abilities, you should sacrifice. Why? Well, because your sex organs do this thing. They can reproduce. That's an arbitrary and false judgment. What we can do is say, if we're actually interested in the flourishing of the whole human, we can say, no, the flourishing of the human is in all their powers as much as possible. And so if we allow that, then we don't let people just say, oh, well, maybe the sex organ can trump everything else. Maybe it needs to reproduce at the expense of people flourishing in their sexuality, their sociability, their emotionality. The point is, that's an inconsistent argument, because none of them are saying, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm only going to use my sex organs to maximally multiply and just make as many kids as possible because of evolution. They don't do that, because they understand that you have to contextualize the various functions within the function of a larger human life. That's a matter of rational consistency and coherence in an overall picture. That's more consistent. And so when they make up, what do? They make up false harms. They try and give a picture because they know there are objective standards of ethics. They know there are standards of internal consistency. They know there are standards of people flourishing in happiness. They know there are standards and people being realized in their excellences. And people, when they're arguing about morality, know those things. There's no reason to concede that we don't have any better reasons about those things, but we're just being subjectivists with a preference. We're not. We're looking at the world and we're saying, what is the most efficient way for humans to live in it? And what we're discovering is, thanks to game theory, we know that a lot of the time that means being willing to make certain sacrifices for our own good. And the final thought is this. I know I'm kind of crushed for time. Okay, still at 5 minutes, great. My whole life. For 5 minutes. No, my point is this, is that I think structurally we can make an argument. This is my way of putting this together. We can structurally make an argument that our own ability to thrive in our own excellences involves the flourishing of others. And because of that, there's an inherent reason for all of us to opt in to a moral system that is mutually empowering. And the reason for that is this. Any one of our excellences, which we should be invested in because they constitute our very being, that's not a matter of arbitrariness. If you lose your arm, that's not like, oh yeah, but I don't like arms. You know, like these are your fundamental constituents, your reason, your emotions, etc. If maximizing those things involves other people thriving, then you have an inherent reason to do that. And what I want to argue is all the human excellences do that. The excellent doctor is not an excellent doctor without empowering people to be healthy. The excellent construction worker is not an excellent construction worker unless they build things that stand. You know, I once was in the car with my construction worker uncle, and he was driving around Long Island pointing out, I built that building, I built that building, I built that building. That's power. As opposed to someone who could just survey a bunch of rubble and go, I destroyed this one, and I destroyed that one. Unless their destruction is part of building something, what is their legacy? What is their power in the world? How are they thriving if what they do is destroy power and destroy functioning rather than spread it? And so my argument is that the best writers are the ones who spread power into their readers. The best rulers are the ones who spread their power into thriving civilizations. It's not the ability to just dominate something, crush it, and destroy it, and say, well, that's all I wanted to do. By their own internal abilities, they fail. Because the best realization of the human abilities is maximum creative ability to create and to build. And to realize your powers externalized in the world and through other people. So when you destroy other people, when you destroy institutions, when you destroy those things, you're a net negative of power in the world, and it's your own loss. Okay, so that's my basic argument. Any questions?
When you're talking, we're thinking about situations in which
Sure.
and I want you to answer these questions.
Sure.
Because you claim that there is an objective morality. First of all, do you think it's moral to torture 1,000 chimpanzees to save the lives of 10 children? Second of all, do you think that you're being immoral by not giving away as much of your own money that you can still subside but save all the lives of African children? And third,
Sure.
do you think it's moral to torture somebody if they have a 50% chance of giving you information to save the lives of African people?
Sure.
According to you, there are objective answers to all those questions.
Okay. Okay, great. My point, let me quickly say, I won't dodge it. I'm a philosopher. I'll take it on. But let me just make the first argument, and this is the point, is that I can come up and say, is there a definition of species that all biologists agree upon? Okay, so then is species a made-up thing? I mean, it isn't. What? Yeah, that's the point. My point is we could look for anomalies, right? We could sit there and say, we don't know how to answer the abiogenesis question yet, right? We don't know how to answer these questions. But then do we say, well, there's no objectivity in biology? Like, in other words, if we can learn slavery's wrong, if we can, and actually make arguments, it's inconsistent, it destroys human flourishing, like it's irrational to treat autonomous beings as merely objects. If we can make all those objective arguments, why does the fact that we have certain cases where our values are in conflict and they force hard choices on us, that doesn't invalidate the general objectivity of the endeavor? Okay, that's my point. So to answer your questions, yes, no, and yes. So the point is this. If you want to talk about the objectivity of the chimpanzees, right, that's going to be an interesting and difficult question about something like what is more important and what will lead to the overall flourishing of powerful living on the planet in the long run. Okay?
For humans.
Okay, good, right. Well, let's put it this way. From the chimpanzee's perspective, probably their perspective, it is objectively bad for them to be tortured, right? Now, if on the long run, if we can justify and say, on the long run, increased human abilities to master the environment, master medicine, master technology, if increased human abilities to do those things leads to actual better outcomes for other animals, right? Actual better outcomes for chimpanzees themselves, right? Like we might find ways to cure actual chimpanzee illnesses. Those, in other words, the issue is on the long run, there's a calculus that needs to be made. Okay, it's not just pleasure versus pain. It's a question of, in the long run, what leads to the most flourishing in the most ways. You say, well, then why not just torture humans to do that? Well, the reason we don't do that is because we saw the kind of devastation and destruction that actually comes from that, from torturing humans in that kind of reckless way, right? We see the way that it destroys and corrodes the social trust, which maintains the social fabric. My point is, these are rational arguments that we will employ. Now, we might not come up with a conclusive answer, but we will use rational means rather than just saying it's just my preference. And the point is, you bring up hard cases because they're hard cases, because they're problems that we need to work on rationally. That doesn't mean there's no answer. It doesn't mean that there's not a long-term answer. And it doesn't mean that no other questions have objectively determined answers that we're clear of. If that makes sense. But anyway, so it's a huge topic.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I'm very interested in these questions. But my observation is that a lot of the conflict that happens in the world in terms of philosophy and morals has to do with people's differences in judgment of what function is more important for a person than perhaps other functions of the person. For example, the sex organ's function is much more important than, say, their function to fulfill their happiness or relationships. So what do you say to these people? What does it count as an overall fulfillment for the person's functions? Are some functions more important than the functions?
Right.
Or are they just equal?
Right, so obviously sometimes it's going to be an equal trade-off, right? Like if you have great ability to do biology and great ability to do chemistry, like, oh, you're going to have to give up chemistry or biology, whatever, whichever, right? But it doesn't matter, they're both good. There's sometimes just have two good values. It doesn't have to be an absolute solution in every case, to be basically objective. The solution isn't just abandon my intellect altogether. Now, the issue within that is, well, let's actually talk to people who made that sacrifice. Let's talk to gay people who were celibate for the sake of this. Did it actually enhance their lives? And we can also say this, is that if you have someone saying you have to sacrifice all these potential good things, so let's take the case of gays. Sacrifice love of the kind with the kind of person you want. Sacrifice romance with the kind of person you want. All of these things just for the sake of making a baby with your partner. Whereas gays can get all of those other benefits and have a baby with someone, a different way. But they can get all those good benefits. It's a trade-off there of like 5 things to 1. And so it's a pretty obvious trade-off. Gays should have the right to flourish in more of their capacities. They can find workarounds for reproduction, and we don't have to serve our genes. That's the last point here, is evolution, looking at evolution for our functions doesn't mean saying only use your abilities in the way that evolution has set them up, because the abilities have objective abilities in themselves. The math we needed to survive in the plains was not the kind of math that we have now, which is theoretical in scope, right, and huge, and reveals a tremendous amount of truth. That sort of math is way beyond what we needed in the jungle, but it's objectively a better fulfillment of the human math ability. So no one should say, well, we shouldn't do that because our monkey ancestors didn't do that. I know we didn't come from monkey directly. You know, my point is that doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if the way we got here was through heterosexual copulation. It doesn't matter. We're not on a shortage for children. We have these abilities. We can realize them on their own, on the objective terms of their own excellence, for their own right. If that makes sense. Okay, sorry.